So basically, I was born in Jerba, in a house of my family in Housh in 1976. My mother is from Habiba. She's from Hara Zrira, the small quarter of Jerba, which have dating almost 3,000 years back. And my father is from Hara Kbira, the big quarter, who the population of it mostly came from Andalus, 15th century, with the Moors. Muslim and Jews were deported from Spain. My mother basically lived in Lafayette in Tunis, and my father lived in Jerba. He was a Hebrew teacher, and he met the brother of my mother, who was a pharmacist in Jerba, and he took a voyage to Tunis, my father, with a letter from his father, my grandfather, with candies, to ask my mother's hand from my grandfather, from her father. First time he refused. I mean, my mother was already quite happy in Tunis. She didn't want to go back to Jerba. Jerba and Tunis are very big, different locations. I mean, especially for Jews, sense of freedom, liberalism, everything. In the end, she decided to come to Jerba and marry my father. I was born, and when I was 1 year old, we moved to Jerusalem, to Israel. That was 1977. We went to Marseille first, and then to Jerusalem. I grew up in a very, very traditional Tunisian family. The language home was Tunsi, Gerbi, the old dialect, the Jewish dialect. School system was a bit hard for everyone, for me and my brothers and sisters. We didn't really match, so we were around changing schools. I was mostly in the streets. Then I went into art school, which was a very, like my attempt basically to escape the family structure that dictates marriage, of course religion, making kids, getting a normal job as every immigrant family. And after art school, it was in Jerusalem. I lived in Italy for a period, and I think there, I think it's more open to me, this basically art world. I mean, the idea of practicing art as something I do in life, not as something on the side, but as a main thing. Growing up in Jerusalem, also for my mother, for my father, I mean, it was, of course, like every community that lives after a long period. I mean, they had to get used to the ingredients, the food, the language. My father spoke a bit of Hebrew, but Old Hebrew from Jerba. My mother couldn't speak Hebrew. My grandmother, until her last day, didn't speak any Hebrew until 2010. So the only language was basically Jerbian Jewish dialect. It's a bit different than the Muslim one. My mother could not source fish, olive oil. All the things that she got used to from Tunis, from Jerba, was completely absent. There are, of course, classes in the Israeli society of Jews from Arab countries, of European origin, Ashkenaz, and all these things. The history of Jews in Tunis, I mean, it was before Tunis was established, of course, many, many waves of Jews, because how Tunis is central to the Mediterranean. Before Carthage, and also during the first temple destruction in Jerusalem 2,700 years ago, there was a group of Kohen Gadol, which is like the high priest, 5 families who took a boat and came to Jerba, basically. Jerba used to be called the Lotus Eaters Island in the Greek mythology. And as before, people used to stay in the middle of the island because of pirates. That was one of the first wave of Jews. My mother's side from the family, they are coming from this part of the high priest of almost 3,000 years in Jerba. They assimilated a lot with Amazigh, basically because for thousands of years they live in the same place. And then there were Jews coming with the Arab conquest of North Africa. There were Jews coming from Spain, like my father's side, Jews coming from Italy, from Tuscany, from Livorno, and that's basically the waves of Jews coming. Very different customs sometimes, lots of struggles between the communities. Not everyone are the same, like people sometimes tend to think. Around the 40s, 50s, that was basically the biggest time of Tunisian Jewish in capital time. I mean, there were a few newspapers printed in Judeo-Tunisian every day. theater repertoire, music scene, very important, cinema, wine industry, bars, clubs, everything basically was very connected to Jews in the 40s and 50s. It was almost a third of the population, almost 100 synagogues active in Tunis. And of course, lots of Jews were not practicing only in the high holidays, in the big holidays. So people, actually it's interesting, but people doesn't know why Jews left Tunis. I mean, I used to teach Hebrew in Dar Ben Ghasem in Kasbah, and even my students who went to come to study Hebrew in Judeo-Tunisia and didn't know why Jews left. People say it's from economical reasons, which is very, in a way, not to speak about what happened, about the elephant in the room. The situation in Tunis and also in the Arab countries have very, very tight relation to the Palestinian issue, of course. When Zionists arrived to Israel, and of course from 48, and they were the minority, and they needed Jews to come for demographic reasons, and also for working hands. So they came. So you have the Jewish agency, basically Israel, sending people to Morocco, and they make secret deals with the king to bring Jews from Morocco. They come to Tunis to convince people that the temple is ready and Jews need to come. In the same time, you have Pan-Arabism, which is a very, very similar sentiment to the Zionists. They're all coming from European national movements who basically don't like others, strangers, walking on borders. So Iraq, of course, Libya, Egypt, majority of the Arab countries deporting the Jews, and in a paradoxical way or not paradoxical way, they do exactly what Zionists want. First, of course, sending Jews to Israel, and also basically forming the biggest war between Jews and Arabs. I mean, basically forgetting what happened a few years before with the Holocaust with the Nazis. In Tunis, the situation was much different. I mean, you have Bourguiba after the independence arriving, and Jews are basically pushed out in positions in the government, in the public sector. Jews start to feel a bit scared. 67, during the Six-Day War in Israel, there were riots against Jews in a very weird way. I mean, the Jews who left here were not part, of course, of the Jews in Israel, but a mob was basically trying to burn houses, mostly in Lafayette. They went into the synagogue, they took away the Torah scrolls. My mother, who lived in Lafayette in the same time, it was very, very weird, but people told her, scream on her, go back to your country, which you cannot find any more Zionist statement from that. I mean, the people who did the mobs, or the mob actually, the people who attacked the Jews were not pro-Palestinian, they were mostly anti-Palestinian. They sent Jews from Tunis to Israel, basically, that's what they did. Until today, I mean, even me, when I do a walk in the south of returning here, you see comments of people with Palestinian flag and they say, why you came back here? We don't want you here. And this is very weird. I mean, where do you want me to be? I mean, if not in my homeland? You want me to go to Palestine, to occupy? I mean, this is very weird statement. And it's very connected to a nationalist agenda, nothing to do with human rights, nothing to do with people who are displaced. Palestinians were displaced by Zionists, they were killed, they have lack of movement, and also Jews from Arab countries in the same time. And this is almost the same sentiment. Israel trying to let people forget about Palestine by talking about Jews from Arab countries, but this is not the role of Israel, because Israel is itself doing exactly what the Arab leaders did to Jews here. And this is something we need to understand, these kind of connections. If we want to start to rebuild a connection between Jews and Muslims in the Arab world, we need to talk about what happened in Palestine, to Palestinians, and what happened to Jews in the Arab countries, because it's the same issues. And it's all connected to nationalism, it's all connected to borders. When we talk about immigrants, now Tunisians, we are immigrants in Europe, in Italy, in France, we try to flee there. And at the same time, we stop immigrants coming from sub-Saharan. This kind of sentiment, this kind of bipolarity that we know very well that's happening in Tunis, but in many, many other countries with complexes of post-colonial, post-dictatorship, are very, very present today. When I came back here first in 2004, I went to see the Jewish cemetery in Bourgel in Tunis. The cemetery was, it's a very, very interesting history, basically. It was, first of all, in Passage, Habib Tamer Garden, until the 30s, when the French decided to build the metro system. They asked the Jewish community to move the cemetery. Of course, you cannot really dig graves out. It's against the Jewish belief. But there were many, many debates, and they decided to move it to Bourgel, which is a bit out of town, out of the city center. And they didn't knew that it was a big water reservoir under. So the tombs moved there, and basically many plants grow there because of the water, and the roots going deep under the graves and then break the graves. Bourgel is the biggest Jewish cemetery in the Mediterranean basin, basically, and it's really giant, and it reflects the number of Jews who were living in Tunis. But it have, of course, a lot of history of displacement, and even now, if the dead are not really sleeping, we say we call the Jewish cemetery in Judo-Tunisian Bet Haim, the house of living. And there is a very, very interesting and deep meaning to it today, because it's the only place that you can find a real Judeo-Tunisian text, poems, text that people left for the family. I had my grandparents buried there because they died from diabetes in the early 50s, almost my age. In the same time, in Jerba, in the Har Zrera, where my mother come from originally, we have, because of the efforts of the Zionist movement, Israel, the official Israel, and of course the Arab countries, we have now the oldest Jewish community continuity, at least from the first temple, living in the planet. There was the Yemenite Jews, Iraqi Jews that were actually also Libyan communities that were very old, and all of them left. And Jerba still having the oldest community. I think it has to do with the anti-colonial sentiment that they have there, that they're really afraid of secularism, they're afraid of any new tradition, so they just basically stayed in Jerba. So this show basically that we are standing now in basically the good 7 years, it's about the last 7 years. When I was visiting Bourgel, the cemetery, for the first time, I was very fascinated from the structure of it, from how basically the dead are moving around, the plantations, and I was thinking how to represent it in an artwork. And I had many ideas, and a year ago I started to work on the direction of a bottle, a big giant bottle, like a terrarium basically, that move from place to place, like this kind of movement of dead, and also the way the new fashion started now, basically that Tunisian Jews in Israel ask to bring their dear ones from Tunis, which is very, very hard for me to understand how people can dig out their people, and because it's actually against Judaism. But it has to do, of course, national sentiment. And it's kind of like movement of dead all the time. I thought about the terrarium, because terrarium started as a colonial idea of British to take gumi from Brazil forest, to take tea from China, and to move it in this national, it's like in its habitat, and basically move it. And I thought about this movement, and then it's developed into a cage, basically, that carry also kind of like Tunisian symbol, and kind of something that's going to remain. Maybe after the cemetery will be floated by water, we don't know what's going to happen. And the cage basically have kind of like the soil from the cemetery, the plantation, and parts of tombs, basically. So, that's how, for now, this is how I realized the Bourgel. Another work that I work now on this show is two pieces of mosaic. We talked about, it's called History Class. It has to do with, even until today, how Tunisian government basically using mosaic as one of the oldest crafts in this region to talk about history, to talk about even government buildings have a big mosaic in the front. And this mosaic piece have my grandmother, Khamsana, which I took photo in 2005, and Halima. And of course, there's absent of women, of black, of Jews, of minorities from this kind of official representations of history. And the piece called History Class, basically trying to pose a question, what is history? People ask me if I'm going to stay or leave. first of all, we never left. I mean, even when we grew up in Jerusalem, I mean, the food, the custom, the culture was a very, very important part of how we grew up, how we cultured ourselves, basically. And especially since I came back, I mean, since 2004, and also in my explorations inside the aesthetics, the life of my family, of myself, it's a bit like this luage here that we put and made an accident. And you can't really go back, basically. It's very hard to, I mean, I become sentimental with this place. And you become sentimental with a place where you feel belong. It didn't happen to me in Italy or Germany or New York. It happened to me mostly in Tunis, and that's, I mean, I'm here now.